Tonight, you will sit at the feet of Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor, and travel 750 years into the past, into one of the strangest and most beautiful lives the Western world has ever produced. A man who carried inside him a quality of stillness so deep it operated independently of whatever storm was passing through the world outside. A man who was kidnapped, imprisoned, condemned, and never lost his peace. That peace is what we are going to find tonight. But before we can understand, we must rest. Close your eyes. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the mattress, just as a stone settles into the earth. Gravity is the first law of peace. It holds you. You do not need to hold yourself. Imagine you are in a stone tower. It is the year 1270. Outside the wind howls. Outside the armies march and the markets shout. But here, inside thick stone walls, the air is still. The only light comes from a single beeswax candle. The only sound is the scratch of a quill on parchment, and the rhythm of your own breathing. You are safe. You are held. You are known. The day is finished. The ledger is closed. Whatever you were carrying when you walked through the door tonight, set it down. Set it down right here, at the threshold of this hour. You will pick it up again tomorrow if you need to, but for now, it rests. Now, let the story begin. Imagine the light first, the light of the Italian south in summer, not the pale silver of the north, not filtered light, but a light that has weight to it, that presses warmly down on the olive groves and the wheat fields and the limestone walls of a small hilltop castle in the Liri Valley, halfway between Rome and Naples. This is the Castello di Roccasecca, the castle of the dry rock. This is where Thomas was born in 1225 into a minor noble family caught, as almost every family in 13th century Italy was caught, in the grinding machinery of the great political conflict of the age. On one side, the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, the most brilliant and terrifying ruler in Europe, the man his own court called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. On the other side, the Pope. Between them, everyone else, including the d'Aquino family of Roccasecca, trying to manage their loyalties and their lands and their futures as best they could. Thomas's father, Landulf, was a practical man. He had 4 sons before Thomas. He understood inheritance. He understood that a 5th son needed a different kind of future. His solution was Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino, the great Benedictine monastery on the mountain, founded by Saint Benedict himself in the 6th century, destroyed by the Lombards, destroyed by the Saracens, rebuilt each time, standing now in the 13th century as one of the most powerful institutions in southern Italy, a monastery with its own lands, its own courts, its own army of servants and craftsmen, and its own abbot, who was a prince of the church. If Thomas could eventually become the abbot of Monte Cassino, the d'Aquino family would be secured for generations. Theodora, Thomas's mother, had a different way of seeing this. She was a woman of profound prayer. The monks noted it, her friends noted it, even her enemies noted it. Before Thomas was born, according to the oldest accounts of his life, she received a vision. A hermit came to her and told her that the child in her womb would enter the order of preachers, a religious order that did not yet exist, and would attain such learning and holiness that there would be no one like him in the world. Whether or not you believe in visions, believe this. Theodora looked at her youngest son and saw something that the castle could not contain. She saw the quality of his attention. She saw the way he went utterly still, not distracted still, but concentrated still, the way a flame goes still in a room with no draught, when something interested him. She saw, in this large and quiet child, the shape of a life pointing somewhere beyond the Liri Valley. When Thomas was 5 years old, she sent him up the mountain. Rest with that image for a moment. A 5-year-old boy on the road to Monte Cassino. the castle below growing smaller as they climbed, the trees closing over it, the monastery emerging from the mountain as if it had grown there, white walls, dark rooftops, the sound of a bell in the clear air above, the gate opening, the child going in. He stayed for 9 years. 9 years of the Benedictine rhythm, ora et labora, prayer and work. The day divided into 8 canonical hours, each one oriented not around productivity or achievement, but around a single quietly radical question. What is God asking of this moment? The monks rose before dawn for matins, they chanted the psalms, they read scripture, they copied manuscripts, letter by letter, word by word, with a patience and a precision that the modern world can barely imagine. Not efficient by any measure we would recognize, but something else, something we have almost lost the word for. Faithful. The labor of a person who believes that the thing being done matters absolutely, regardless of how long it takes. Thomas thrived inside this rhythm. He was not a difficult child by the monks' accounts. He was something more interesting, deeply attentive. He listened to the chanting with a concentration that the older monks found unusual. He sat in the scriptorium watching the copying with an absorption that went beyond curiosity into something quieter and more serious. And he asked questions. One question, really, over and over to different monks and visiting scholars in different forms. The monks recorded it because it unsettled them, not because it was aggressive, but because it was so simple and so deep and so completely without a satisfying answer. But Master, what is God? Not does God exist. Not is God good. Those were answerable questions, questions with prepared responses the monks could locate in the appropriate texts. Thomas wanted to know the nature of the thing itself. What kind of being is God? What is the interior life of the one who made everything? If God is not a creature, not a thing in the world, not subject to the limitations that bind everything else, then what precisely is God? The monks answered as well as they could. Thomas listened and nodded and thanked them and asked the question again, from a slightly different angle, because the answer had not yet reached the depth from which the question was coming. He was 5, then 7, then 9. He asked the question the way a river asks its way through stone, not with violence, but with the quiet, inevitable persistence of something that will not be redirected. Here is the first lesson of Thomas's life for you tonight, carried across 7 centuries to this room, this dark, this moment. You were given a question when you came into the world, not a question you chose, a question that was already in you when you arrived, the way an acorn already contains the shape of the oak. The question is specific to you. It is the form of your deepest hunger, the shape of what your soul is reaching toward. And most of us, by the time we reach adulthood, have learned to silence it. The world does not reward people who walk around asking unanswerable questions. The world rewards people who deliver answers, quickly and with confidence. So we bury the question under work and noise and the management of small urgent things. We become very busy, very productive, and we lie in the dark at night with a formless unease we cannot name, not realizing that what we are feeling is the question, still alive in the depths of us, still asking, still reaching, still pointing in the direction of the thing we most deeply need. Thomas never silenced the question. For 45 years he carried it. He refined it and deepened it and approached it from new angles and climbed to altitudes of understanding no one in the Latin West had reached before. And the question never became smaller for all that attention. It became larger, more beautiful, more precise, because the question was not a problem to be solved. It was a direction to be traveled, and the faithful, unhurried, unfrightened traveling toward the thing you most deeply want to know, that traveling is itself a form of rest. You do not have to answer your deepest question tonight. You only have to stop running from it. Let it be there beside you in the dark, like an old companion who has been waiting patiently while you were busy. The child in the monastery corridor asking his unanswerable question is asking it for you right now. And the silence in which the question hangs is already the beginning of the answer. Thomas was 15 when he came down from Monte Cassino. Not by choice. Frederick II's armies had moved through the valley and the monastery had dispersed. The boy returned to his family and after a period at home was sent to the newly founded University of Naples. Frederick II had created this university in 1224 for a specific purpose. He wanted to break the monopoly that Paris and Bologna held over higher education, and he wanted to do something that no institution in the Latin West had yet dared, to teach the whole of Aristotle. This requires some explanation, because the name Aristotle does not carry today the charge it carried in 1240. For 8 centuries, since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Christian theology had been built almost entirely on one foundation, Augustine of Hippo. Augustine was brilliant, oceanic, inexhaustible, but Augustine was a Platonist. His world was a world of shadows and light. The material world was the shadow, the spiritual world was the light, the body was suspect, matter was at best a distraction. This had shaped Christian thinking about the body, about the physical world, about the relationship between reason and faith for 800 years. Aristotle was different, not opposed to God. Aristotle believed in God, argued for God with considerable philosophical force. But Aristotle's God was arrived at by looking at the world, carefully, empirically, with the precision of a man who had classified 500 species of animals and written treatises on physics and logic and the nature of the soul. Aristotle took the material world seriously. He insisted that knowledge begins with the senses, that the physical world is the proper starting point of genuine understanding, that reason and the evidence of the created world are not enemies of truth, but its instruments. When this philosophy landed in Naples, this entire, rich, rigorous, world-affirming system of thought, it landed like a fire into tinder that had been quietly drying for centuries. Thomas walked into it at 15, already very large, already very quiet, already carrying his unanswerable question. And the encounter with Aristotle was not the encounter of a student with a textbook, it was a recognition. The philosophy and the question recognized each other the way two people recognize each other in a crowd, the sudden arrest of attention, the stillness of discovery, the sense of a thing fitting into a space that has been waiting for it. At the same time, in Naples, Thomas encountered the Dominicans. Dominic de Guzman, a Spanish priest of radical intelligence and radical poverty, had understood something about the crisis of the Church in his time that the established orders had not grasped. People were not leaving the Church primarily because they were wicked. They were leaving because no one had given them a compelling, intelligent account of why Christian faith was true. The Cathars and the various heretical movements of the age were winning not by force, but by argument, by offering people a coherent, intellectually serious account of the world that the official church was failing to match. Dominic's answer was revolutionary, an order of scholar preachers, men who would go to the universities, acquire the best intellectual formation available, and then carry it out into the streets and argue for the faith in public, with reason, against all comers. And they would own nothing, no lands, no fixed houses, no endowments. They would beg for their bread and go where the need was. Thomas saw them in the streets of Naples, barefoot, in their black and white habit, thin and unhurried and free in a way that the housed and politically entangled church he had known at Monte Cassino was not free. And he knew, in the way that the deepest recognitions happen, not as a decision, but as a discovery, that this was his life. He took the Dominican habit at 19, in secret, because he already knew what his family would say. There is something I want you to feel in this moment, before the storm that followed, the moment of recognition before the world responds to it, the pause in which the truth is simply true, before the complications arrive. You have had this experience, not perhaps with a religious order, but with something, a person, a vocation, a direction, a way of seeing, that arrived with the quiet certainty of a thing recognized rather than a thing decided. Before the family opinion, before the practicalities, before the weight of other people's expectations descended, there was a moment of pure knowing, a moment of yes. That moment was real. It does not require external confirmation to be true. The intellect, responding to truth, knows what it knows. Hold your own moments of recognition gently tonight. The true ones, not the impulsive ones, not the wishful ones, but the ones that had the quality of depth and stillness in them. They were real. They are still real, and they are pointing somewhere. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary episodes in the biography of any philosopher, and it is almost entirely ignored by the people who teach Thomas Aquinas in universities. Perhaps because it is too strange, perhaps because it is too human. His family found out he had taken the habit. His brothers, 2 of them, acting on the direct orders of his mother Theodora, intercepted him on the road north of Naples, heading toward Paris and his Dominican formation. They dragged him from the road, they tore at his habit. He clung to it with both hands until they stopped pulling, and then they put him on a horse and took him home. He was locked in the tower of the family castle at Roccasecca, a room at the top, stone walls 2 feet thick, a window overlooking the valley. He stayed there for 12 to 15 months. The accounts differ on exactly how long. The family's logic was entirely understandable and entirely wrong. They had invested heavily in this child. Monte Cassino, Naples, the private tutors, all of it was preparation for Thomas to become a prince of the church. The abbot of Monte Cassino was a major power in southern Italian politics, and Thomas was throwing all of this away to beg for bread in the streets with a group of intellectual vagabonds who had been founded 30 years ago. They sent theologians to argue with him. He out-argued them all. They sent his sisters, who loved him, who wept. He held their hands and explained with patience and warmth why he was not going to change his mind. They sent family members to press the case of the family's honor and future. He listened to every argument and answered each one and remained immovable. Then, according to every early biographer, and this detail is too specific and too strange to have been invented, his brothers tried something else. One night, they brought a young woman into Thomas's room. Beautiful, by the accounts. Specifically chosen and specifically sent, with the specific intention of breaking his vow and closing the door of the Dominicans to him forever. Thomas looked at her. He understood immediately what was happening. Then he reached into the fireplace, took hold of a burning brand, a piece of wood still alight, and drove her from the room. Not in cruelty. In the same absolute clarity with which he had done everything else since the moment of recognition in Naples. This is not my life. This is not my direction. This ends here. He shut the door. He went to his knees on the stone floor, and he prayed until the light came through the window. The biographers record that he fell asleep afterward, and that in his sleep he dreamed of 2 angels who came and wrapped a white cord around his waist. A cord of the vow he had just defended with everything he had. He woke with a physical sense of the cord still there, and he was never troubled in the same way again, not because the temptation was suppressed, because something had been settled, something had moved in the deep interior of him, from the realm of the possible to the realm of the decided, and decided things are restful in a way that perpetually undecided things can never be. His mother eventually relented. She could not break him. She arranged, with her own kind of dignity, for his escape, lowered in a basket from the window of his tower room to the Dominicans waiting in the darkness below. He walked north into his life. He never looked back. Here is what I want to give you from this chapter before we move forward. We exhaust ourselves with the undecided, the options we keep perpetually open, the version of our life we keep imagining instead of living, the commitment we almost make and then pull back from again and again, each time paying the full emotional cost of the decision without actually making it. The in-between place, not fully in, not fully out, is the most exhausting place in the world to live. Thomas in his tower made the movement, not because the consequences were clear, not because his family approved, not because the path was mapped. He made it because the thing was true, because the recognition was real, because the cord, whatever else it was his. The closed door is not always a loss. Sometimes the closed door is the first real freedom. When Thomas shut that door and went to his knees, he was not being confined. He was making the single movement that would make every subsequent movement possible. He was choosing, with the full weight of his will, the life that was already his. You do not have to decide anything tonight, but you can rest in the direction that is already true for you. You can stop expending energy on the performance of undecidedness and simply let yourself know what you know. The cord is already there. Let it settle. Thomas made his way north, through Rome, through the Alpine passes, through the great cities of the Rhine Valley. In 1245, he arrived in Cologne. And in Cologne, in the lecture hall of the greatest mind in Europe, he chose to sit in the back row and say almost nothing. Albert of Cologne, Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, was already a legend by the time Thomas arrived. 60 years old and at the full height of his powers. He had studied everything: botany, zoology, mineralogy, astronomy, alchemy, medicine, philosophy, theology. He had walked through the forests of Germany, collecting specimens and filling notebooks with descriptions that read, to a modern reader, like the work of a brilliant field biologist. He had written on subjects that would not be formally classified as separate disciplines for another 4 centuries, and he was engaged in the project that Thomas would inherit and complete, demonstrating with philosophical precision that Aristotle and Christian faith were not enemies, that Greek reason and divine revelation were 2 rivers flowing toward the same sea. Thomas entered his lecture hall, sat in the back, said almost nothing. This requires understanding, because Thomas was not shy and he was not intellectually uncertain. He sat in the back and stayed quiet because he was doing something more important than talking. He was listening, totally, with the concentrated, consuming attention of a man who knows that what he is hearing connects to something enormous, that the argument being built in this lecture hall reaches all the way down to the foundations of reality, and every stone must be placed precisely or the whole thing will not stand. He took notes in a hand so small and so compressed that his fellow students called it litera intelligibilis, the unintelligible script, and his classmates, seeing a large and silent and apparently unremarkable student who contributed nothing to the intellectual life of the hall, made the obvious and completely wrong conclusion. They called him il buemuto, the dumb ox. There is a story, preserved by every early biographer, because everyone who witnessed it understood something important had happened, of a day when a fellow student, genuinely kind, genuinely well-meaning, offered to walk Thomas through the previous day's lecture, to explain it slowly, in case he hadn't followed. Thomas accepted the offer with complete and apparently genuine courtesy. He sat, he listened to the explanation, and then, without any trace of condescension, without any relish in the reversal, he began to ask questions, questions that opened outward, That went deeper. That revealed layer by layer that Thomas had not only followed the lecture, but had followed it further than the lecture itself had gone, had anticipated objections Albert had not yet raised, had seen connections between what Albert was arguing today and what Aristotle had written in a different text, and what Augustine had said in a third, connections that resolved a tension sitting in the middle of medieval theology for 200 years. The classmate sat very still. Then he took Thomas's notes to Albert. Albert read them. The accounts all pause here, as if the witnesses could feel the ground shift, but could not describe the feeling. Then Albert looked up and said, "You call him the dumb ox. I tell you, this dumb ox shall bellow so loud that his bellowing will fill the world." He was right. But that is not the lesson for tonight. Tonight the lesson is in the back row, in the small, compressed handwriting no one else could read, in the young man who had been kidnapped and imprisoned and argued at and tempted and released, and who arrived in this lecture hall with all of that behind him, and chose to sit quietly, to listen, to receive, not to perform his intelligence, not to establish his reputation, not to use the lecture hall as a stage for displaying what he already knew, to take in. Thomas understood something the modern world has nearly lost, that understanding and displaying understanding are entirely different activities, and that the energy spent on the display is energy not spent on the development, that the loudest voice in the room and the deepest voice in the room are rarely the same voice, that the intellect does its best work not in public performance but in interiority, the quiet interior space where ideas meet each other and generate light, undisturbed by the noise of ego and the pressure of audience. He sat in the back of that lecture hall and became, through silence, one of the greatest minds in the history of Western civilization, not despite the silence, through it, because in the silence something real could happen. You have been performing today, not dishonestly, but performing in the way all of us perform when we move through the world, the competent version, the version with answers, the version managing the impression it makes. It is necessary, that performance, appropriate, but it is not you, not the deepest you. Tonight, in this dark, in this bed, the performance is over. You do not have to have the right answer. You do not have to project confidence. You do not have to manage the impression you make on the ceiling above you. You are just yourself, large and quiet, carrying more understanding than you were able to display today, sitting in the back row of your own life, taking notes in a handwriting no one else can read. That self, the unperformed, unmanaged, genuinely interior self, is the self that God sees, not the performed version, the real one. And the real one is far more interesting and far more beloved than the performance could ever be. Be the dumb ox tonight. Settle into the silence of your own depth. Let the surface of the day float away like foam, and let your attention sink down into the deep, still place where you simply know what you know, and simply are what you are, and no applause is required. The bellowing will come when it comes. For now, the silence, the interior, the back row. Thomas returned to Paris in 1252, sent by the Dominicans to begin what we would now call doctoral studies. He was 27. He was about to walk into the most ferocious intellectual controversy of the century. The fault line ran through everything in the intellectual life of the 13th century. On one side, the conservatives, the Augustinians, the theologians who believed that the Christian intellectual tradition, as received from the fathers, was complete and sufficient, that Aristotle was a pagan whose errors could not be reconciled with the faith, that Thomas's project was not merely unnecessary, but dangerous. Their most formidable spokesman was a Franciscan master named John Peckham, brilliant, orthodox, deeply serious, deeply hostile. On the other side, Thomas, who held, with equal certainty and equal seriousness, that truth is one, that God is truth, that Aristotle, following reason faithfully where it led, had arrived at genuine truth, not complete truth, only revelation completes the picture, but genuine truth. And genuine truth, wherever it comes from, a pagan philosopher in Athens, a Jewish rabbi in Cairo, a Muslim scholar in Baghdad, cannot ultimately contradict the revealed truth of God, because both come from the same source. This conviction Thomas held the way he held everything, quietly, precisely, without drama, with the patient certainty of a man who had thought about it too carefully to be moved by passion rather than argument. The debates in Paris were conducted in the formal medieval style of public disputation, each position stated, each objection raised, each reply given in precise sequence. The whole university watched. By the testimony of those present, Thomas won, not by emotion, not by volume, by the architectural precision of his arguments. There was simply more depth, more range, more careful attention to the best case the opposition could make. The intellectual floor of the room had settled, by the end, at Thomas's level. But winning the debate did not end the controversy. In 1270, the Bishop of Paris issued a formal condemnation of philosophical propositions being taught at the university. Then, in 1277, 3 years after Thomas's death, a second condemnation, broader. 219 propositions condemned as contrary to the faith. Among them, unmistakably, positions at the center of the Summa Theologiae. Thomas's own positions. The man who had given his life to defending the faith of the Church was condemned posthumously by a bishop of that church. The irony is almost too large to process. The condemnation was lifted within 50 years. Thomas was canonized in 1323, declared a doctor of the Church in 1567. Today, the Summa Theologiae is the foundational text of Catholic theological education. The synthesis he fought for is now simply the water that Catholic intellectual life swims in, so thoroughly absorbed it no longer feels like a synthesis at all. But in 1277, Thomas was dead and condemned. Here is what I want you to carry from this into sleep. Thomas spent his adult life doing work of extraordinary quality and integrity. He was careful, thorough, honest, humble, genuinely open to correction. He did not seek controversy. He sought truth, and the controversy found him, and the institution he gave his life to condemned him for it. He could not control that, could not manage the reception of his work, could not ensure his arguments were understood in their full complexity, his intentions fairly credited, the good faith behind the project recognized. None of us can. You cannot control how what you do today is received. You cannot guarantee the quality of your effort is seen, your intentions understood, the full truth of who you are acknowledged. The condemnation may come from a colleague, from a family member, from your own internal critic at 2 a.m, and it may not be deserved. It probably is not entirely deserved. Most condemnations are not. Thomas's answer was not to stop working, not to withdraw, not to mount a public defense or collapse into wounded silence. It was to continue, calmly, productively, with the same quality of attention and the same quality of love, not in defiance, in faithfulness, in the simple, steady, daily commitment to doing well what he had been given to do, regardless of how it was received, because the work was not for the reception, the work was for the truth, and the truth does not require the approval of a bishop to remain true. Rest in that tonight. The truest things you have done today were true whether or not anyone saw them. The love you gave was real whether or not it was perfectly received. The effort you made was worthy whether or not it was recognized. The real things stand, regardless of the condemnation. Now let us talk about how Thomas actually worked, not the legend, though the legend is astonishing enough, not the simultaneous dictation to 3 secretaries, though this is apparently true, not the sleep dictation, though Reginald of Piperno, who was there, swore to it. Let us talk about what happened before the dictating. Every morning before Thomas sat at the desk, he knelt, not briefly, not as a ritual gesture before the real work began. He knelt until something changed in him, until the interior weather settled, until what his tradition called consolation descended. That warm, clear, focused stillness that comes when the self stops performing and simply rests in its relationship with God. He prayed with the specific intention of becoming available, of opening, of receiving rather than producing. Then he sat at the desk. Reginald described watching Thomas write in a way that has stayed with commentators for centuries. He said Thomas did not seem to be constructing arguments the way a builder constructs a wall, brick by brick from material gathered by effort. He seemed to be finding them, as if what he was looking for existed somewhere just ahead of the writing, complete and already formed, and his task was to move carefully in its direction and lift it into language without breaking it. When the writing became difficult, when the argument would not come, when the formulation eluded him, Thomas did not push harder. He stopped. He got up from the desk. He knelt at the kneeler. He prayed again. Then he returned. And the argument was there. There is a story, directly attested by Reginald, that when Thomas was working on a particularly difficult passage about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, he stopped entirely. The argument had not come. He went to the chapel. He spread his manuscript on the floor in front of the crucifix, knelt over it, and prayed. The accounts say he wept. Then he returned to the desk, and the argument was there. There is also the famous anecdote about Thomas at the table of King Louis IX of France, Saint Louis, the most powerful and most genuinely holy king of the age. The court was at dinner, the conversation lively and loud. Thomas sat in his characteristic abstracted silence, present in body and largely elsewhere in mind. His Dominican brothers had long since accepted this with resignation, and then, suddenly, Thomas brought his enormous fist down on the table. The cups rattled, the plates jumped, the entire court fell silent, and Thomas, apparently unaware of anything unusual, said aloud in a voice of complete satisfaction, "That settles the Manichaeans." He had been working through an argument against the Manichaean heresy, silently, in his own interior, while the court talked around him, and the argument had arrived, and he expressed his satisfaction in the only way that occurred to him. His Dominican companion, mortified, leaned close and hissed, "Brother Thomas, you are at the king's table." Thomas blinked, returned to the room, registered the staring court and the king regarding him with an unreadable expression. St. Louis, who was more concerned with truth than with decorum, and who was, by all accounts, genuinely charmed by Thomas, turned to his steward and said, "Go immediately, bring a scribe to Brother Thomas. He has had a thought that must not be lost." Thomas, who had thought he might be in serious trouble, looked at the king with what the biographers describe as uncomplicated gratitude. "This is what I want to give you tonight, as the sleep draws closer. You have been trying to produce today, to generate from your own resources the energy and clarity and wisdom the day required. You have been drawing from your own reserves all day, and there is a particular exhaustion that comes not just from effort, but from the sustained attempt to be self-sufficient, to produce what you need from within yourself, by force." Thomas says, "You were drawing from the wrong tank. The self-generated resources are real, but they are limited, they deplete, they run empty at the end of a hard week, at the end of a hard season, at the end of years of sustained giving without adequate receiving. But the received resources, the light that comes when the interior is quiet and the hands are open, Those are not yours to run out of. They come from a source that does not run dry. Thomas called it lumen intellectuale, the intellectual light, and he was clear: the intellect does not produce this light, it receives it. Its task is not to generate illumination from its own resources, but to become quiet enough, available enough, for the light to come. You cannot receive anything while you are clenched, while you are managing, performing, efforting, pushing. You can only receive in the posture of openness, hands unclenched, breath slowed, the interior turned down to the hush of a room before sleep. That is exactly the posture you are in right now. The posture Thomas spent his working life choosing deliberately. You have arrived at it naturally, by the grace of the night. Let it be enough. You do not have to generate tomorrow tonight. The argument will arrive. It always does, for the one who has learned to wait for it. Open your hands. Let the light come. It is December 6th, 1273, the feast of St. Nicholas. Thomas is in Naples, living at the priory of San Domenico Maggiore, the place where 30 years ago he first took the Dominican habit, first encountered Aristotle, first recognized the direction of his life. He is 48 years old. He has written approximately 4 million words. The third part of the Summa Theologiae is underway. The secretaries are ready. The ink is prepared. The pen is at hand. He rises before dawn, as he always does. He puts on the vestments for Mass. He goes to the chapel and approaches the altar. And then something happens. He stops. He stands very still, not the stillness of a man thinking through an argument, not the concentrated stillness of a man in ordinary prayer. Something different, absolute. The witnesses in the chapel could not afterwards say precisely what they saw, only that Thomas stopped, that his face changed, that the normal quality of his presence in a room was replaced by something else, something that made the servers and the congregation fall silent and simply wait. He stood like that for a long time. Then, slowly, he came back. His eyes returned to the room. He completed the Mass. After that morning, he never wrote again. Reginald found him later that day in his cell, sitting, not writing, not reading, looking at a point in the middle distance. Reginald asked if he was ill. Thomas said he was not ill. Reginald pressed him about the Summa. The third part was unfinished. Articles still to write. A lifetime of work left without its ending. Reginald could not understand. Thomas looked at Reginald and said, "Reginald, I cannot. Everything I have written seems to me like straw compared to what I have seen and what has been revealed to me. Mihi videtur ut palea." Straw. The dry residue after the grain has been separated, useful for bedding, useful for burning, not worthless, but not the thing itself, not the wheat, not the bread. 4 million words, 50 volumes, the Summa contra Gentiles, the Summa Theologiae, the commentaries, the biblical expositions, the liturgical hymns still sung 7.5 centuries later. All of it, like straw, not because it was wrong, because it was less than. It was the map, not the territory, the description, not the thing, the finger pointing at the moon. And now, in the chapel of San Domenico Maggiore, on the morning of December 6th, he had been shown the moon. 3 months later, called north to the Council of Leon by Pope Gregory VI, Thomas set out sick and worsening. On the road near his niece's castle, he was struck by a falling branch while riding. He never fully recovered. He asked to be taken to a religious house. The nearest was the Cistercian monastery at Fossa Nova. White walls, clean lines, no ornament, the silence of a community that had chosen to let nothing compete with God. He lay in the infirmary. The monks gathered. He asked them to read to him from the Song of Songs, that ancient, luminous poem of the soul's longing for God and God's longing for the soul, the most intimate of all the scriptures, the text in which the love between God and the human person is spoken in the most direct and unguarded language the canon contains. The monks read it aloud in candlelight. Thomas lay still and listened, and looked at the ceiling with the expression that no one who saw it could afterward describe. In the last hours they brought him the Eucharist. He sat up. He took the host in his hands, those enormous hands darkened with decades of ink, and he said, "I receive you, price of my soul's redemption. For love of you I have studied, watched, and labored. I have preached you and taught you. I have never said anything against you. If anything I have said was not right, I submit it entirely to the correction of the Holy Church. In obedience to her, I depart this life." Then he lay back. The monks continued their office, and in the white silence of the Cistercian night, on March 7th, 1274, the greatest intellect of the medieval world went still. He was 50 years old. He owned nothing. He had given everything away, not just his possessions, stripped by his vow of poverty, but the deeper things, the reputation, the comfort, the need to be seen. He had given all of it to the work, and the work had become, on the morning of December 6th, straw, not because it was worthless, because it was a road, and roads exist to be arrived from. Albert the Great, now 80 and nearly blind, received the news in Cologne. He wept. He said, he was the flower and the glory of the world. God has revealed great things to him, things not revealed to any other in this age. Here is what I want to leave with you as the sleep comes in. Thomas spent his whole life moving toward something. The question he asked at 5 years old in the corridor at Monte Cassino, "But Master, what is God?" He asked it for 45 years. He asked it in the lecture halls of Naples and Cologne and Paris and Rome. He asked it on his knees in 100 different priory chapels. He asked it in 4 million words. And then, on a December morning in a chapel in Naples, the question was answered, not by his own intellect, not by any argument he constructed, by the direct, unmediated, gratuitous gift of the vision, the thing the Christian tradition calls contemplatio, the direct contact of the soul with its source. The moment when the river finally reaches the sea, and the water of the created soul mingles with the water of the infinite, and the travelling is, at last, complete. The words became straw, not because they were worthless, but because they had done their work. They had been the road, and now he was no longer on the road. He had arrived. Your life is a road. The anxiety and the effort and the management and the performance and the 1,000 small acts of keeping everything together, these are not the destination. They are the walking. And the walking has a direction, even when the direction is not visible, even in the dark stretches, even on the mornings when the fog is thick and the road is narrow and you cannot see past the next few feet. You are walking toward something, the same thing Thomas was walking toward, the same thing the question inside you has always been reaching for, the vision, the arrival, the moment when the question is answered not by argument, but by encounter with the answer itself. You will not get there tonight. Thomas did not get there until the very end, but you are on the road, and every day that you live faithfully, every day you do the work you were given with the quality of attention it deserves. Love the people in front of you with the love they need. Open your hands to receive what only God can give. Every such day is a step closer to the chapel in Naples. And the thing waiting at the end of the road is not straw. It is the wheat, the bread, the nourishment for which all your hunger, all your restlessness, all your unanswerable questions have always been reaching. The story is finished. The candle at Fossa Nova is burned to a rim of wax and a thread of smoke. Outside, the Italian countryside is dark. The monks have finished Compline, the last prayer of the day, the prayer before sleep, and the night has taken everything, and you are here, in your room, in your darkness, Aquinas, the day finally and fully releasing its grip. Let the 7 movements of Thomas's life settle into you now, slowly, without effort, the way sediment settles in deep and undisturbed water. The child at Monte Cassino asking his unanswerable question in the monastery corridor, who teaches you that your deepest restlessness is not your enemy, but your compass. The question you carry is pointing somewhere real. You do not have to answer it tonight. You only have to let it point. The young man in Naples, feeling the truth arrive with the quality of recognition rather than decision, who teaches you that the moments of deepest knowing are given, not manufactured. Your own moments of recognition were real. Let them be real tonight. The prisoner in the tower at Roccasecca, on his knees on the stone floor, finding in the decided thing a peace the undecided thing could never give, who teaches you that the chord is already there. The decision to rest has already been made. You only have to lie still long enough to feel it. The dumb ox in the back row of Albert's lecture hall, writing his incomprehensible notes while his classmates pitied his silence, who teaches you that depth does not require display, that the unperformed self is not less than the performed one, but more. You are deeper tonight than today showed. That depth is yours. It is real. It is beloved. The condemned scholar of Paris, continuing his work with the same quality of love after the condemnation as before, who teaches you that the real things stand regardless of reception. The truest things you did today were true whether or not they were seen, whether or not they were rewarded, whether or not they were understood. The man at the desk in the priory cell, returning to the kneeler when the argument would not come, who teaches you to open your hands. You do not have to generate tomorrow tonight. The light comes to the one who waits. You have been drawing from your own reserves all day. Now let something flow back in. And the man in the white room at Fossa Nova, holding the host in his ink-stained hands, submitting everything to the God he had spent his life describing, closing his eyes in the peace that exceeds all understanding, who teaches you that the walking has a destination, the destination is real, and you are, tonight, closer to it than you were this morning. Let your breathing slow now. Let it become the breathing of a man or woman who is no longer responsible for keeping the world in motion. The unmoved mover has that covered, as Thomas would remind you. The first cause is sustaining you at this very moment, your heart beating, your lungs filling, the atoms of your body holding their form, without any effort on your part. You did not earn this moment of existence. It is given, simply given. Receive it. Let your thoughts lose their sharp edges. Let them soften and drift, like the cloud that passes the moon and changes shape and dissolves, and the moon remains. Your thoughts are the clouds tonight. Let them pass. The mountain holds. Thomas of Aquino, Dr. Angelicus, the angelic doctor, lies in the infirmary at Fossa Nova, and the monks read to him from the Song of Songs, and the candles burn low, and the question he has been asking since he was 5 years old is finally, fully, completely answered. Not in words, beyond words. The map is straw, the territory is everything, and you, in your bed, in your darkness, in the irreplaceable and unrepeatable particular life that God has given you, you are loved with the same love that carried Thomas from the castle on the hill to the monastery on the mountain, to the tower, to the lecture hall, to the vision, to the white room at Fossa Nova. The love that does not tire, the love that does not run dry, the love that saw you before you were born and has been with you every step, through every confusion and every clarity, every failure and every faithfulness, every question and every glimpse of answer. You are on the road. The road is real. The destination is realer still. Adoro te devote, latens detas. I adore you, hidden God. Mihi videtur ut palea. Everything I have written is straw. What I have been given to see is everything. Requiescat in pace, rest in peace. Sleep now, in the shadow of the question that is also your compass. Sleep now, carried by the love that holds all things. Sleep now, on the road that leads, through everything, home. The monks finish compline. The last candle goes out. The night takes the stone walls, and the white rooms, and the ink-stained hands, and the 4,000,000 words. And what remains, in the silence at Fossa Nova, and in the silence of your room, is only this: the peace that Thomas carried inside the storm. The rest that does not depend on circumstances. The stillness at the center of the turning world. The answer, patient and eternal, at the end of every question. Good night, good night, good night.